Bootstrap has some fantastic built-in styles for forms. There's a lot of options, so it deserves its own chapter. Let's go ahead and get started by using the styles available to a basic form. So you can see here that I've created a form with the traditional input elements. I don't have radio buttons, but they're pretty much like checkboxes, and we'll get into detail on those later. Now, before we get started with forms, make sure that you add label to input fields. So for example, right here, I have a label for this email field, and they are generally matched. So when I say label for input email, that is matched via this ID right here to this input field. And that does a couple of things. Number one, whenever you click on one of these labels, it's going to activate the input field. That's really important for mobile devices because it makes it easier when you're filling out a mobile form to be able to tap on the label and have it activate the element. The other reason you want to do that is for screen readers for the disabled. If you don't add labels to your input fields, a lot of these screen readers are going to have trouble reading your forms. Now, there's a special class called the SR only class that you can use to hide the labels if you don't want to use them, but want screen readers to be able to see them. So if I say something like class here, SR only, then this name will disappear from here, but it will show up on screen readers, which is a really nice feature and just something good to do. Now, the first step to making your forms look great is to add a form control class to your input fields. And what that will do is make their widths 100% of the container. So if we say input class equals form control here, you can see that the name input field gets a little bit of padding around the element. It also gets a nice color when I highlight it, and a good deal of spacing that looks great, plus that 100% width. So just adding that is going to make those fields look a lot better. Let's go ahead and copy that and paste it here on my email. That's making the email section look really good. I can also add it to the select field if I want that to be 100% width. So that looks really nice now. And I can also put that on my text area. So let's go ahead and add that right here. Save that, and now my text area is going to be 100% of the width of the container, which is really nice, and you can see that it adjusts really nice to the responsive grid. Now, if you want to add a little bit of spacing between the groups, you can wrap them with a form group class for a little bit better spacing. So you can see that name and email are really close to each other. If we wanted to create a little bit of separation, what we would do is just add a div and call it form group. Let's go ahead and put these in here, space them out a little better. So now you can see that we get a little bit of spacing between this first name and the input field and the email. So we should do that to all of these. Let's go ahead and do form group here as well. Now, checkboxes are a special case, and as I mentioned, I have an entire movie just for them, but basically they get placed inside a div with a class of checkbox, and you use a label which wraps the input field. In HTML, when you wrap a label around a for element, then you don't have to use this for right here. So we'll do that to this checkbox. We'll get this label. We'll delete this for right here. And then we will wrap the input field inside this label. And we're going to put this inside a div with a class of checkbox. So we'll do this. And you can see that the label on a checkbox and a radio button goes usually to the right of the element, whereas in some of these other elements, the label goes before the input field. Now, on the input type submit that you usually do to submit the form, you can just add a class here. So on input buttons, you can use the class of btn and then the contextual class, which will determine the button's use as well as the color. So here we would do class equals btn, and then btn default, or you can use one of the other contextual classes. Let's go ahead and save this. You can see that the button looks really nice. This is also a great place to use the pull right class if you want to align the button with the right side of the screen. So if we just wanted to align that button to the right, which I sometimes like to do, you can just put pull right in here. And now the button will be on this side. You can also use controls like input fields. And in that case, they don't necessarily need to submit. So a lot of times you'll have in your pages input fields that are not necessarily wrapped around form elements, usually for like calculators, or maybe you're using AngularJS. So in that case, you probably want to use a button type instead of an input type. If you're using a form element, though, this is okay. Forms are another one of those styles that I really appreciate, since writing all the CSS for them can take a long time. So I really like that Bootstrap has a well thought out system for styling form elements. There's a couple of extra options that you have to keep in mind when working with radio and button type input fields. So let's take a look at the things that we can do. In this example, I have a super simple form with a regular input field, as well as another section with 2 checkboxes. Now, just to review, to organize normal input fields into groups for proper spacing, you put them inside a div with a class of form group like this. When you do checkboxes or radio buttons, you place controls inside a div with a class naming the type of control. So you add a div with a class of checkbox like this. And what's different about this is that the labels are wrapped around the control instead of traditionally placed next to the controls, and don't have a for attribute. So you can see this label right here doesn't have the for attribute like this label up here. And this one is on top of the input field, whereas this other label, the one name right here, is sort of embedded inside the label. And that's why it doesn't need this for input type. There isn't a lot of difference between radio controls and checkboxes other than the main semantic reason for them, which is that you use checkboxes when you want the user to be able to choose one or more options. So in here, I want the user to be able to pick 1 and or 2. Let's go ahead and change these controls to radio buttons. So what I would do here is just look for every instance of checkbox and change that to radio. Now, if I refresh, you'll notice that in here, I can actually pick both of these at the same time. What makes you be able to choose only one of these is by making both of these input fields have the same name. So if I add a name and just make it the same, I'll call it options here, and I'll save it. Now, when I try to click on one of these, it'll highlight. And then if I click on the other one, it'll unhighlight this one and it'll highlight the new one. Because they have the same name, I can't choose both of them at the same time. Bootstrap provides a special style for disabled control states. So if we add a disabled state to a control, so if I come over here and I say disabled, then when I try to select that element, and it's the one right here, you'll see that we get this different icon. If you want to make sure that that happens when you roll over the label, what you do is you also add a disabled class in this div right here. So you would say radio disabled up here. And now the label as well as the control will have that same icon. And it's not going to allow you to choose this. You can also run checkboxes or radio buttons as a series of inline elements. Now to do that, you add a class of radio inline or checkbox inline at the label level. So if we grab this one right here and we add a class of, this is a radio right now, so we'll say radio inline, and we'll do the same thing for this other one right here. Now this is almost right, except that they're not going to show inline unless we get rid of the div right here. So I'm going to get rid of the div wrapping around these two here. and now they'll run side by side. However, the last one is also pulling my next input field. So if I wanted to make sure that that was spaced separately from the submit field, then I would just put it inside a control group. So I could do this and also make sure I close that out. And now I have a group of radio elements that are side by side. Let's go ahead and get rid of this disabled. And now you can see that I can pick either one of those just fine. So just really a couple of extra small things to remember about checkboxes and radio buttons. The option to make these controls inline elements really makes styling forms in Bootstrap super easy. Bootstrap has some styles that can help you work with inline forms. That is, forms where it makes sense to make the layout horizontal. So let's take a look at this. Now these styles will apply only to layouts that are at or bigger than the SM breakpoint, or bigger than 768 pixels. And that's why I'm going to make my preview really wide here, and then I'm going to scoot this over this way so that you can see it happen. So making a form inline is actually super easy. All you have to do is add a class of form inline to the element wrapping the form. So right here, I can add a class of form inline, and you can see that the layout for the form is now horizontal. Now this doesn't necessarily have to be a form element. A lot of these shorter forms are just input fields that have hooks to processors that might be in JavaScript, like when you work with AngularJS. Another thing that's super popular in these shorter forms is to hide the labels. And the problem with that is that screen readers for the disabled are going to have problems with that. So whenever you want to hide a label, you should use the class of SR only. That way it'll only show up on screen reader devices, and disabled people are going to be able to at least hear what the labels are, even if they don't show up in your design. So let's do that for this other label here. So we'll add that right there. And you can see that they disappear now. What I was saying before was if I make this form a little bit smaller at the less than 768 pixels, it is going to show stacked up anyways. So this only works on slightly bigger sizes, and that's why we have to do this. If for any chance you want to center the form, so sometimes I want these to be sort of in the middle of the page, all you need to do is a text align center. So on the CSS, I'm going to target this form inline and just do a text align of center here. And when I save it, you'll see that this form is now in the middle. There is another option that allows you to put elements right next to the input fields, and they'll show up side by side, but it can get a little complicated, so I'm going to cover that on a separate video. Now, inline forms are excellent for situations where you have a very short set of inputs, like when you're searching or logging people in. So the fact that Bootstrap provides styles for those is a huge time saver. One of the Bootstrap layouts that can be really useful when working with forms is called the horizontal layout. Now, this is especially true for mobile users because although labels to the left of input fields look great on the desktop, mobile devices zoom to an input field and can sometimes hide any labels that are on the left of the input field. These classes essentially use the Bootstrap grid system to show controls beside the labels on a wider layout. It's not going to work on a view that is smaller than 768 pixels. So I'm going to take this beginning form and just make the page a lot bigger so that I can show you what it looks like. I'm going to scoot this over this way. And the first step is to add the form horizontal class to your container element. So I'll do a class here and make this form horizontal. And I'm going to save that. It's not going to do very much. It's just going to get rid of a little bit of the spacing here. After I do that, then I'm going to go to each of the form elements and control their layouts with columns. So for example, for this div right here, form group, what I want to do is tailor this label to have a class I'll say COL because that's the keyword for columns, and then SM, which means the breakpoint at which I want this layout to take over, and then how many columns I want this element to take. And so since this is going to be the labels, I'm going to say SM2. Let's go ahead and save that, and you can see the email here moved in a little bit. That's not quite done yet because we also need to add a div around the input field, which has this column definition. So I'm just going to grab that one out of there, and I'm going to create another div here, and this one's going to have a COLSM, and I will do 10. Remember that Bootstrap is a 12 column system, so whenever I do columns, they have to add up to 12 like this. So once I do that, you can see that my email and my input field are side by side. I'm not quite done yet. I also have to add another class into my label right here called control label. So once I do that, you see that everything aligns beautifully. And I'll need to repeat that for most of my elements. The checked box as well as the submit button are going to be exceptions. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I've done these for all these fields and everything looks pretty good except for the checkbox as well as the submit button. I want those to be pushed in here. So I'm going to have to treat them a little bit different. So I'm going to go to this checkbox section right here. And first of all, I'm going to add a form group class that wraps the entire checkbox, just like the other ones. And then I'm going to add another div. And this one's going to lay out the column. So I'll say it'll have a class of COLSM10 as well as COLSM offset of 2. That means that this element is going to occupy 10 columns, just like the other input fields, but it's going to be offset by the 2 columns that normally my labels would take. So if I do that, you can see that it scoots over into the right position, and I need to do the same thing to the submit button. So I'm going to grab it from here and just take my submit button and replace. And I don't need this div for the checkbox either, so hopefully that works well. I actually think that this checkbox right here should actually be right in this order instead of before the column. I should put the column definition first and then the checkbox. So although a horizontal form takes a bit of effort, it's my favorite form layout because it works really well for both mobile devices as well as desktops. And let me just show you that this layout looks pretty good right now. But if I go to a smaller layout, when I get to that 768 breakpoint, I get the really nice labels on top of my form elements. Bootstrap has a few styles that you can use related to validation. So let's explore what you can do and how you can do this in a way that is sensible to users with disabilities. Now, I have just about the simplest form that you can create right here. It's really just an input of type text as well as a label. Now, with Bootstrap, you can add a few classes that will determine the validation state, or at least show the validation state to the user. So in addition to adding this class of form group here, we can also add a has warning right here. And you can see that this input field now gets a yellow border. There is also the has error, which shows up as red, and also has success, which shows up as green. If you want the label to also be affected by this class, you have to add a control label class here. So let me do that. We'll say control label. And now both the label as well as the input field will get that color. And let's go ahead and try some of these other ones. So has error. You'll see that they're both now red, and has warning. They will both be yellow. But let's go ahead and switch this to has success just so that we can show you some other things. You can also add icons to your validation in order to offer visual feedback about your forms. Now, these are only going to work with textual inputs with a class of form control. First, we have to add a class of has feedback to our control. So in our form group right here, we can say has success and then also has feedback. And then in addition to that, we can add an icon. So I'm going to put this icon right after this input field. And we're going to say span with a class of glyph icon. And then after this, we need to specify the icon that we want to use. So we would say something like glyph icon OK. And we would also put in a class of form control feedback. And what that will do is add this little checkbox right here. The icons that Bootstrap uses are part of the glyph icons library, which you can find at this URL. Now, the particular set that it uses are called halflinks. So you have to go to this tab right here, and it's going to show you 260 icons. If you click on these icons, you can see the names of the icons. Now, here, this one's called halflinks OK, and you just have to translate a little bit because in Bootstrap, they're called glyph icons. And in this case, is glyph icon OK. So if you see another name, you don't call it halflinks, you call it glyph icons. If you see another name here, you know that this one would be glyph icons and then inbox. So that's what you do to add an icon here. Another good idea is to add the area hidden tag here, which means that this icon doesn't make any sense for people who are disabled and can't read what a checkbox means because they can't see. So if you add an area hidden attribute here and you say true, this will hide this icon on those type of screen reader devices. Now, for screen readers, what you also want to do is go ahead and add some other feedback. So you would want to add something like a span. I'm going to give this an ID of name status. I'm going to add a class here of SR only. So the SR only class means that this will only show up in screen readers. And I'm going to say something here textual like success, which will be the screen reader equivalent of this visual checkbox that we've entered in here. We also have to add an attribute to our input field so that we can tie this span to the proper control. So in the input field, we can add area described by, and we have to issue that same ID. So I called it name status, and now this input field is tied to this span right here, which shows only in screen readers. Adding this type of feedback to a form is a lot of work, but it's always a great idea to provide feedback that's beyond average, and being a usability compliant website is the right thing to do for your visitors. Bootstrap has a really cool feature called input groups, which allows you to combine fields together with other elements to create some really interesting controls. Let's take a look at how they work and how we combine input fields with other types of form elements. So here I have a very simple form, really with just one input field. It's surrounded by a form group, and it also has a label. And it's the kind of thing that maybe you would see on a store somewhere where you can put in your price. So let's go ahead and modify this. First, I'm going to get rid of this label altogether, and then I'm going to wrap this input field inside an input group div here. Now, if I want to add a text element to this input field, then what I can do is create a span with a class of input group add-on, and I'm going to put a $sign in here. And you can see that it looks like a little label to the left of my input field, which I think looks pretty nice. Let's go ahead and add another one. You can do as many of these as you want. We'll put this one at the end, and we will say 0.00 just to indicate that somebody can type in a full dollar figure and they don't have to type in cents. And I'll modify this label just to say something different. So let's try something else. Let's say that you're building an application and you want people to be able to enter their own options for a field. So this might be a place where you can combine something like a checkbox with an input field. So it doesn't just have to be textual items like this. So in order to do that, I'm going to modify this by adding a input field inside this input group add-on span. So here I'll do an input, and this will be a type of checkbox. And I do want to use the Arial label here. And I'm going to say this is a checkbox, but you can put something that shows the users who are using screen readers what this checkbox is about. Maybe this could be something like custom checkbox to allow users to type in their own options. And I'm going to save this and take a look over here. Now I have a checkbox as well as an input field that I can fill out. Of course, these other labels don't make any sense now, so let's go ahead and modify those. This would be something like write your own option. And I can probably take this last 0.00 label off, although if you wanted to, you could leave that there. Just imagine a form where maybe you would ask users to fill in their own option for one of the fields. This may be a good place to put in something like the checked option on this checkbox to make sure that as it loads, it's already checked, and then you allow the user to type in their own option after a list of options. Now, it's really important that you use an area label for the checkbox. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it's just a way to allow the disabled to have better access to your forms. Now, you can also use this technique to create a really concise search form, and I really like this one because it looks great and it makes it super, super tiny. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and delete this stuff right here and just type this one in. So I'm going to add an input field here of type text. This class is going to be form control. And then I'm going to put a placeholder here. This will be search terms. I want to add a button here as an input group element, so it gets a slightly different class. So I'll do a span, and this span is going to have a class of input group btn because we're going to put a button in here instead of text. So in here I can use my button, and this button will have a class of btn default, just like a regular button, and then it's going to have a type of button, and then in here I'll put in just go, or you could put search if you wanted to, and maybe search would make a little more sense here. Search, so we'll do that, and now you have a super concise search box where the users can very quickly type something in and hit this button. It's important that you use an input group btn here and not a regular input group, because then it would sort of put the button inside of the input group area. Input groups are a great way to create really short forms that pack a lot of functionality into a small space. Bootstrap has some other miscellaneous styles that can help you do things like handle form states as well as resize your input fields. So let's take a look at how they work. Now, for example, if you want to add a disabled attribute to an input field, Bootstrap fades it out as well as change the icon. So if we come right up here into this name input field, we can add a disabled attribute, and you can see that it shows up sort of the background in a different color, and when we roll the mouse over that area, it shows us a disabled icon, and I can't click on this now. So you can do the same thing to other input field types. For example, we have a checkbox right here, and again, all we have to do is add a disabled attribute here. Now you can see that it shows up a little lighter, and I can't click on it anymore. If you want to do that to this label right here, then what you need to do is right here in this div where you add this class of checkbox, you can add a disabled class. And when you roll over this label, it's also going to show you that little icon right there. Now that's not going to work for other labels for some reason, but it's sort of nice to have it on this checkbox input field because it's really very much related to the checkbox, and it kind of looks more like it belongs together than these other ones. So you can also add this if you have field sets, and right now we don't have any, so let's go ahead and add a field set. Field set allows you to group certain areas of the forms together. So if I come right up here and I add a field set, and in a field set you have to add a legend, and I'll call this basic info, and then I'll take the closing tag and I'll put it after these first three sets. And so you get a style that looks like this, and now these first three elements are going to be grouped together. Let's do another one so that the rest of the elements can be in a different group. So we'll do another field set, and again we'll do a legend, and we'll grab this field set end tag and we'll put it right before the closing form tag. So now you have two different areas of the form. Now you can go ahead and disable the entire field set by just putting a disabled attribute in the field set tag. So if we just grab this and we say disabled, then all of these elements become disabled. And then we don't really need to put the other disabled attribute on the name input field. These are all going to be disabled. You can also create something called a read-only input. That is an input that shows up but doesn't let you modify it. So let's get rid of this disabled attribute right here. And in this name part, let's assume that I want to go ahead and just add my name here. So I'll just do that. Now you'll notice that it doesn't look like it belongs with the rest of the elements. And this is actually a horizontal form layout. You can really see it sort of looking weird right here. So what you want to do when you do that is you can leave the input field, and instead of the placeholder name, you can maybe put in the name here, and that would have to go like in a value as well. Then you can add a read-only attribute here, and then that field becomes a read-only field. You can't modify it. People can't type anything in, and you'll see that it aligns really nice when I go into the horizontal layout. You can also create text that takes up the same space as a control by using the form control static class. So let me show you how that works. Say, for example, that instead of this disabled or read-only input field, I wanted to actually just have some text right there. So what you would do is you would still have the column here for this input field, but instead we will add a paragraph, and then I'll just put my name there. And in this paragraph, we can add a class of form control static. And now this has my name instead of the form control. Notice that if I take this out, you can see that it doesn't align quite properly. So if we do that, you'll see that it's a little bit too far up. So by adding this form control static class, I make things align really nicely with the rest of the form. Let's go ahead and undo that and bring back the input field. So I want to show you something else, and I'll take off this read-only part right here. So we're back to having this input field. There's also several styles that allow you to change the size of your controls. These work like the different button sizing styles, but there is currently no XS size. So you can add a class right here on this name input field called input LG, and that input field will be a lot bigger. In the same way, you can do an input SM, and that makes the control a little bit smaller than normal. Now they can also go inside select pop-ups, and if you want to control the labels, you can use the form group LG and form group SM classes. So you would say form group here, And then you would say something like form group SM. And that would also handle the label of that particular input field. And in the same way, you could do form group LG, and that handles actually both of them at the same time. So in that case, you wouldn't need this input SM here. You would just do it all at the form group level. So these are just a couple of miscellaneous form styles that didn't really seem to fit in other places. Although you might not end up using some of these often, it's nice to know that they're there when you need them. Bootstrap comes with a set of really useful icons from the Glyph Icons library. They're a subset from this main library called halflinks. So if you go to the glyphicons.com website, you can find all of them right here under this tab. There's about 250 or 60 icons, and what you do is you click on any one of these, and you can get the code for them by clicking on this cut button right here. But you have to keep in mind that in Bootstrap, they're not called halflinks. They're just called glyph icons. So there's also a search right here. So if you're looking for something like a play icon, you can type the word right here, and the search gives you just the icons you're looking for. So let's see how you implement these into Bootstrap. Now, as I mentioned, if you grab the icon from the Glyph Icons website, you get a little piece of code that looks like this, but in Bootstrap, they're not called halflinks. They're still called glyph icons. So you'll need to replace the word halflinks with the word glyph icon. And then you get the icon like this. Now, if you place this icon inside another element, so let's go ahead and switch it to the print icon here. And I'm going to rename this headline print. And I'm just going to paste the icon right here. So you can see that when I place it inside an H1, it looks about the right size. And if I switch it to any other headline level tag, it's going to do the same thing. Just resize to something that looks like its context. So if I grab this out of here and I place it in this paragraph, let's go ahead and put it kind of in the middle of the paragraph. So I'll paste it right there. Notice that it works really well inline, and it always resizes itself to the context that it's in. So let's go ahead and take it out of here, and I'm going to put it back here and just leave it there. Now you might see these used with an I tag instead of a span tag. So some people like to do the icons with an I tag. That use is a little bit controversial, so span is considered slightly more correct. Now the span tag shouldn't have any text inside it, and you should add an area hidden of true attribute so that a screen reader doesn't try to read the actual icon. So if you're using it like this, then you should add an area hidden of true here. That doesn't make sense because normally a screen reader will try to grab an element like this and read it to somebody, where in this case it doesn't really need to be read. All they need to know is that this headline says print. You can also use these inside of buttons. So let me go ahead and grab this right here, and I'm going to create a button, and this is going to be of type button, and my class is going to be btn and btn default. And what I'll do is inside here, I'm going to paste the icon just like I had before. Let's go ahead and put this on a new line just so they can read it a little bit better. And then after this, I'm going to put in the text print. I forgot the T here. So it looks pretty good. If you want to use it without the actual word next to the icon, so by itself, let's say that you just wanted to do an icon and you didn't want to put any text inside it. So you would do it like this. In that case, what you want to do is to go ahead and add an area label in the button HTML. So right here, we would add an area label attribute just describing what the button is going to do. So I would do something like this, and that displays just as a button with an icon inside. By adding area label, you have given screen readers a little bit more information so they can perform properly. Now, icons are a great way to enhance the look of your site, but it's always important to remember to make your site as accessible as possible to everyone so that every type of user can enjoy a great experience.